We're at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and I am interviewing Mr. Jimmy Grizzard about the experiences of his father in World War II and his military service. And Mr. Grizzard's father is deceased, and Mr. Grizzard has kindly agreed to come and talk to us so we can put this information on file with the Atlanta History Center and the Library of Congress. Would you state your name, please, sir?
My name is Jimmy Grizzard, Jr.
And Ms. Grizzard, could you give us your address and your date of birth?
And my date of birth is 8/21/41.
Okay. We really appreciate you coming in here today and discussing your father's experiences. And I'll be asking you about his upbringing, his military training, his military service, and his life in general. Would you tell us a little bit about your dad's upbringing, where he was born and his family?
Yeah, he was born in Nashville, Tennessee on November the 2nd, 1910. His father at the time, my grandfather, worked for the Standard Candy Company in Nashville, Tennessee. And he was a traveling candy salesman. They lived there until my father was in his mid-teens, and my grandfather bought a letter service in Atlanta, Georgia, and they moved from Nashville to Atlanta at about that time, and it became the Grizzard Advertising Company, which is still extant today. Dad lived in Atlanta from that time on, and he attended Boys High, which is now, I guess Grady is still there. I'm not sure.
It is.
But it was Boys High at the time, and he graduated high school there. And then he went to Emory University for his undergraduate degree, and in 1936, he graduated from the L.Q. Lamar School of Law at Emory University. At that time, he started practicing law in Atlanta, and he subsequently went to work for the mayor of Atlanta as his executive secretary. That was Mayor Roy LaCroix before World War II. During his tenure as executive secretary to Mayor LaCroix, he joined the Georgia National Guard as a private. He was encouraged to do this by a man named George Finch, who was a lawyer in Atlanta. And he said, he told Dad that the war was coming. This was in the late 30s, that the war was coming, and it would be a good idea if he joined the National Guard at that time, which he did.
And what year was this?
It was in the late 30s, I think about 37, 38. Time marches on, and Major Finch goes to Washington and gets a commission from the United States government to form the Georgia Air National Guard. And he came back, and of course all of his lawyer friends in Atlanta at that time was an overgrown small town. Everybody knew everybody else, and it was no part of the vast metropolis that it is now. But Major Finch got together with all of his lawyer friends, and he sat down and he said, all right, I'm going to be the commander of the Georgia Air National Guard, and you're going to be a lieutenant, and you're going to be a captain, and you're going to be a lieutenant, and so forth and so on. And so he literally, out of his own head, organized the Georgia Air National Guard. Dad was commissioned a second lieutenant, and very shortly after that, he was called to, in 1940, he was called to active duty. His job at the time was as an observer in an airplane, a 3-seat airplane. I say 3-seat, it had 2 seats and a compartment. This was a single-engine, single-wing airplane that had a pilot and a radio operator and an observer. The observer lay in a perspex bubble underneath the airplane, and he lay on his belly and looked down out of the airplane to observe what was going on. Well, they sent him to Louisiana, and he flew 30 combat missions in 40 and 41 over the Gulf of Mexico looking for German submarines. Well, luckily he never found any, but he got 30 combat missions for that tour of duty.
Going back to when he went into the service, how did his family feel about that, or his parents? Were they reluctant? Were they glad?
No. My family has always been very, very patriotic, and service has been a hallmark of the Grizzards. Both of his grandfathers served in the Confederate Army. One of them as a cavalry officer under Nathan Forrest. So it was no. I suppose that there wasn't even any question that he would that if he was needed, he would volunteer for that.
Okay, so now he's gotten his 30 missions in.
Yeah.
What happened then?
And he's a captain now. He's been promoted twice to captain, and being an attorney, he decided that he didn't want to spend the rest of World War II, however long that was going to be, flying around on his belly in an airplane looking for German submarines. So he applied to the, there was a call for people to volunteer for the military government school at Charlottesville, Virginia. And he was accepted. It was an honor, because it was one of those things where several hundreds applied and only 1 out of 10 or 2 out of 10 or what it was got selected, and he was actually the youngest and one of the lowest ranks in the school. He was in the 2nd class at Charlottesville. He took his military government training there, and sometime during that time, I was born in Atlanta, Georgia. This is 1941. Before the war had, before the war for America had started. Well, of course, in December when the war started, he was already on active duty. He had been on active duty since the 40s, and he was assigned to the military government corps. Well, his job was going to be to administer occupied territories after the combat troops got through taking enemy territory. Well, of course, in 1941, we hadn't taken any enemy territory. We were being pushed back on all fronts during that time. So he was sent to the Pentagon for a duty, and I think maybe he was in military intelligence, because he never would talk about it. It was one of those things, he said, I can't tell you and don't ask. So after that, he was assigned to the military government corps and was shipped to North Africa. While he was in North Africa, the Allies, of course, were just bringing 2 nations' armies together. The British, in this case, the British 8th Army, and in the American case, the American 2nd Corps. And there were a lot of problems involved in melding these 2 armies into a fighting force that could be commanded centrally. Well, one of the things that they did is they took accessory personnel, people who were not in combat units, and they tried to move them from the American Army to the British Army and the British Army to the American Army to sort of meld the idea that we were all one outfit, one unit. And in North Africa, he was seconded to the British 8th Army as a liaison officer, and his job in North Africa. He didn't have a job because North Africa was not an enemy territory, so he was waiting on an invasion from somewhere. He got to the British Army, and of course it was a change, a drastic change, and one of the changes was that British officers, all of them, got batman. That's a sort of an aide-de-camp and body servant. Even second lieutenants in the British Army get a batman. And that was a new wrinkle, because in the American Army you have to be a general officer before you get anything close to that. And then the British Army issued every officer an imperial quart of Scotch whiskey every month. Well, Dad said that in the American Army, in his experience, the officers got a quart, just a regular quart, of bourbon, and the minute they got it, they drank it all, and it was gone. But in the British Army, you took your quart of whiskey, your imperial quart, which was more than a regular quart, and you took it to the officers' mess, and they took possession of it and put your name on it. And if you wanted to take a friend to the officers' club for a drink, then you could draw for your own issued supplies there. And that appealed to him. And so he took a good look around and decided that he liked the British Army real well. Well, subsequently, of course, history will tell that the Allies moved from North Africa to Sicily, and there Dad got his first job. He was in charge of a small town that, of course, had been devastated by the Germans. And in his book that the Atlanta History Center has a copy of, he describes in great detail his job.
Would you give the name of the book?
Oh, yes. The book is The War Was More Than the Roar of Cannon, a story of the Allied occupation of Italy. Dad's job as a military government officer was this: when the combat troops moved through an area and drove the Germans, in this case, back, the Italian army, of course, had pretty much disintegrated in North Africa. And by the time the invasion of Sicily came along, the Italian army was almost not a consideration. So it was all the Germans that the Allies were fighting.
And what was the time period of this?
This was in late 42, early 43, late 42. So he went along on the invasion of Sicily and was given his first town to administer.
I'd like to ask you a question. Did he ever talk about how he felt when he first was told he was getting ready to go, in fact, invade Italy? He was still in Africa and he got the orders to head out. Did he ever talk about his feelings of either fear or excitement, or?
It was trepidation more than anything else, not for fear that he would get hurt or anything like that, because his job was not normally to be in the first wave assault. He was supposed to follow on after the territory had been taken. But as he says in his book, the job that he had to do was no part of the training that he had gotten in Charlottesville. And he looked at these people. He didn't speak the language. He didn't know anything about their culture or mores. And he was, before it happened, he was very concerned that he would be equal to doing this job, particularly since this outfit that he was in, which is called AMGOT, that is the Allied Military Government Occupation Territories. It was sort of a well, we need these, but we don't know exactly how to do it. They put him ashore in Sicily. He didn't have any transportation. He didn't have any troops under him. he didn't have anything. Anything that he showed up in this town alone. And anything, in fact, he was dropped off in a truck, and then the truck left him there. So here he was alone in this town full of dead bodies and dead animals and destroyed buildings, and people who had fled the scene in the beginning were infiltrating back into the town. And his job, his primary job, was actually, well, as he says in the book, it was to bury the dead, feed the living, and but essentially his job was to keep the civilian population from interrupting the military activities of the armies. The Allies didn't want a bunch of refugees in the roads where they had to move tanks and supplies and all of that stuff. So his job was to see to it that these civilians were taken care of. They were fed and housed as best possible, received medical attention and that sort of thing, and stayed out of the way of the fighting. Well, he arrived at this town alone, and he didn't have any idea about how to go about doing what his job was to do, or with what means he was to do it, because he had to literally beg. If he needed assistance from a soldier or troops or anything, he had to go ask them. He couldn't order them to do anything. He had to go make a request of them, and they would either come do it or not.
Do you know what town it was? Did he ever?
It's in the book,
Okay.
and I don't remember the town. There are so many of them,
Yeah.
because he over the next 2.5 years he moved from Sicily, the assault in Sicily, all the way up through the boot of Italy, and he wound up at the end of the war in Albania, which was an interesting story. But his Dad was never one to shirk any responsibility, and he decided that he was there. He was going to do what he could do. And one of the stories, and I don't remember whether it was in this town or another one, but the people were evacuated. They had evacuated themselves when the Germans pulled out, because the Germans, in order to cause the Allies as much problems as possible, wanted to destroy every bit of infrastructure that was there so that the Allies couldn't use it when they got there. All of the buildings were blown up, all of the water mains were destroyed, the sewage systems were destroyed, and the most important thing is that the Italians, living off of pasta, that is wheat, had to have the wheat ground, and they were invariably destroying all of the mills, the flour mills. That there was plenty of grain, but if the flour mill was destroyed, there was no way to grind it into flour. So that was his job, is to set all that back up as best he could, and to take care of these people who were starving and hurt and refugeed and all this stuff. I was leading to something, and I'm not sure exactly where I was going. Oh, the people re-infiltrated back into this town after the Germans moved out and the Americans moved out, or the Allies moved out. And he found the priest, who was the highest ranked Italian in that little town, and he told him, he said, these people in this town that are all dead have got to be buried, and of course they're all, the vast majority of them were Catholic. And he said, you need to go around here and gather up some people and bury these people now, because if you don't, there's going to be an epidemic disease here. We've got to get these dead bodies, not only humans but animals, because the Germans destroyed everything in their wake to keep the Allies from having anything to use. Well, the priest went out, and everybody was in such bad shape. The Italians were in such bad shape, the Sicilians, and they were in such a state of shock that the priest couldn't do anything. He couldn't get anybody to do anything. And so he came back to Dad and told him that he couldn't, there wasn't any way that these people could do anything, that they were just absolutely in a state of shock. He said, well, he said, let me tell you what I have to do. He said, I know that the Catholic Church doesn't hold with cremation, but these bodies have got to be disposed of right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a 5-gallon can of petrol, that's what the British call gasoline, and I'm going to burn each one of these bodies in place. That's the quickest, safest way to do this. And of course some of these bodies were in buildings that had been destroyed, and the buildings were about to collapse, and there wasn't any way you could go in and rescue even the bodies because the building would fall on you. So he did. The priest said, well, I understand your situation, but I can't condone it because my faith doesn't allow that. Well, Dad says it's either a matter of your faith or thousands dead from typhoid or diphtheria or something from these dead bodies. So he did. And he said that the process of burning all of these dead bodies that were just laying in, and they laid them in place. They burned the buildings down around them. Of course, the buildings were all destroyed, but they burned the buildings down around them, and he said the smell from the burning flesh stayed with him the rest of his life. He never forgot it. But that was essentially his job, and of course in the beginning it was extremely difficult for him particularly, because nobody knew what was needed. Nobody knew you're going to send this man in to administer the civilian population. Well, what is he going to have to do? As time went on, they figured it out, and when the Allies got to Italy, they got better organized and better equipped to do this job. But in Sicily, it was just a real situation of man over matter.
How did the people treat him once he was in there and settled? Did they welcome him with open arms, or were they scared of him? Or
well, aside from being in shock, and of course having lived for 20 years under an Italian dictatorship, and then for several months under a German occupation, as long as there wasn't somebody literally walking the streets to sack them up and send them 500 miles off to slave labor camps, or shoot them on the spot, they were ecstatic. There was one of the concerns that Dad had was exactly how is this administrative duty of mine going to be accepted by the Italian people, and he says that there was no problem with that at all. That once the Italians found out that they were literally there to help them and to help them mend, to rebuild their infrastructure, to feed them, to house them and clothe them, and tend to their medical care, they responded just like you would expect someone to respond to that. So the war in Sicily finally was won by the Allies. Patton went to Messina, and Montgomery got there shortly after that. And there is a 5-mile straits between the island of Sicily and the European continent, the tip of the Italian boot. And right on the very toe of that boot is a little town called Reggio Calabria, and it's 5 miles across the Straits of Messina. They stayed there until the next spring, and then the Allies decided after much, he's got some part of this, but during that period of time the Allies were involved in mass deceptions about where the Allies were going. There was the man who never was a story of a man that a dead man that they dressed up in a British major Marines uniform and dumped him over the side of a submarine, and he floated onto the beaches in Spain, and he had bogus documents on him, and the Germans thought by that the Allies were going to invade Sardinia and the Peloponnesians and all of this stuff, when actually they were going to go right across the Straits of Messina into the toe of the boot of Italy, and that's where the invasion was going to start. Well, this, I think, is in April of 1943. And the Germans had moved out of southern Italy. They had essentially evacuated southern Italy because it's a little complicated. The geography is such that it is extremely difficult in that part of the world to have a defense because of the peninsulas that stick out all over the place. So they retired behind a defensive line further up the boot of Italy. And the Dad was called into his commanding officer's office one day, and he says, "You're going on the first wave assault into Reggio at 4 o'clock in the morning." He says, "Oh, yes, sir." So he got on a landing craft in Messina, and it went across the Straits of Messina, and he got off just north of the little town of Reggio Calabria. Now, it was Calabria was a provincial capital, and the municipo, or the city hall there, always had flagpoles sticking out everywhere because the fascists were real interested in flying a lot of different kind of flags. So he and his British counterpart got off the landing craft. They were not under fire. And they walked up the hill to the municipo. And Dad had been issued an American, a 48-star American flag. And when they got to the municipo, he and his British counterpart went up to the second floor of the municipo and took the two main flagpoles and ran the British out on one flagpole and the Stars and Stripes out on the other. And one of Dad's colleagues turned to him and he said, "Jimmy, do you realize what you've just done?" And he said, "Well, no, it's been a pretty tight morning." He said, "You have just raised the first American flag on the continent of Europe during the Second World War." Now, it wasn't until 2 weeks later that the 7th U.S. Army landed further up the boot of Italy. So Dad's flag is the first one ever to be raised in World War II in Europe.
Whatever happened to that flag?
Well, he brought it back. In fact, in his book he tells the story that his commanding officer wanted it. And he said, "Well, sir, I can give you a legalistic argument, and that is that it was issued to me and I'll have to have my receipt for it before I'll surrender it." He said, "But really," he said, "this is a historical thing and I'm going to keep it and take it back to America with me." Which he did, and the ship that he rode back on, when they entered New York Harbor, flew that flag from the ensign staff. But
Is that flag still around today?
somewhere, well, maybe not. He gave it when he got back. He gave it to the military department of Georgia, and several years ago, I asked him where it was that I'd like to see it. And he, of course, he hadn't thought about it in years. And he went back, the administration had changed and nobody knew anything. Well, after I don't know what kind of a search, but he says a comprehensive search, they declared that it was lost, that they couldn't find it and they don't know where it is. So maybe one day it'll turn up, maybe not.
Yeah.
But that's what happened to that.
So he's on the continent of Europe now. He's in Italy.
He's on the continent of Italy, and he is now the military governor of Sicily. And of course, to a greater or lesser degree, the duties, when they got to Italy, they finally got some transportation, and they finally got a police force attached to them, associated with them, that they could use to pacify the civilian population. And one of Dad's jobs was as judge, administrative judge. And the police, the Allied police, or the Carabinieri for that matter, the Italian police, of course there was no civilian authority where he was, because he was the first on the scene after the fascists pulled out. They would arrest somebody for some miscreant deed, and they would bring them before him to for judgment. And he had the, I don't know exactly what his authority extended to, but I suspect that he had the authority of life and death over these people. Not that he ever used anything as drastic as that, but he had one case that was fairly interesting, of course, with all the people that were screwing up and messing around. He had one guy that was running a restaurant. And the GIs in the British Army, the thing that Dad did not like about the British Army is their combat rations, which is primarily what he got to eat, was a can of bully beef. Bully beef is what we would call corned beef. And it was about 50% fat and about 50% of the toughest, stringiest meat that ever was, and hardtack, which is a biscuit that they used during the war between the states. It's just a plain unleavened cracker that has no leavening in it. It's not right. It's sort of like a compressed saltine cracker with no salt on it, and that's what they existed off of in the British Army. That was what they had to eat, and of course the ubiquitous tea. Well, there was a rule against the Allies trading food, or it was against the rules for an indigenous personnel, an Italian, to have any of these military supplies. They didn't because they would invariably wind up on the black market. Well, this fellow running this restaurant had access to fresh vegetables and fresh meat, chickens and pork and stuff like that. And these soldiers were just absolutely adamant about getting rid of some of these rations that they were issued. So and because they didn't have any refrigeration and they didn't have any canning facilities, this bully beef and cracker would last forever. These people, the Italians, would take them and store them against a time when they didn't have anything to eat, because it would keep. It was non-perishable. Well, this fellow was in a busy deal trading his fresh stuff for these cans of corned beef and crackers, and he got caught with all of this stuff, and they brought him before Dad, and Dad found out that this fellow was not in the black market. He was running a restaurant, that he actually was doing the army, the troops, a service by giving them something to eat beside this awful stuff. And so he acquitted him. Well, of course, the word got around in the little town that this captain over here, boy, he's real soft. He doesn't really know what he's doing. And said the black market is wide open. Well, of course, Dad subsequently had to put the kibosh on that. He had to show them different. But in this one fellow's case, he let him off. It was very much like someone moving into a small town in Georgia and absolutely taking over. Whatever he said went. And of course, he didn't have the people weren't belligerent toward him, which made it a whole lot easier. But he had the force of the Allied forces behind him, and they knew it. So there was very little problem with administering his duties. As he moved up the boot of Italy, it was the same story time and time and time again. So that essentially is what Dad did in the Second World War. in your questionnaire, you asked, was he ever wounded? The answer is yes. In Italy, he was called a spearhead military government officer, which meant that just as quick as the rifle fire subsided, he would go in, and sometimes even before that, artillery and air attacks were still going on where he was trying to administer these towns. And he, of course, they had bunkers and slit trenches and stuff like that to dive into when the air raids came or the artillery barrages came. But it was in the middle of the night one night, and he had taken off his .45 that he'd been issued, and he put it on the nightstand there. In Sicily, pretty much he had to stay in a pup tent. In Italy, of course, he was able to requisition billets for himself and his men, pretty much. But this was in Italy, and he was lying in bed, and the air raid siren of the artillery barrage started coming, and of course he got up and jumped out and went and got in his bunker, got in his dugout. And as he was diving into the dugout, a piece of shrapnel came and cut him on the leg. Well, it was a severe enough cut to where he was bleeding pretty good, but it didn't incapacitate him at all. And so he went to the aid station, and they bandaged him up. And of course, being with a British unit, there wasn't any such thing as a Purple Heart form or anything like that, and he wasn't interested in that anyway. So he never applied for one, and he never got one. But he said the worst thing about that particular occasion was that when he got back to his billet had taken a direct hit. It had just completely destroyed it, along with his .45 automatic. Well, he'd been issued that. There was a receipt somewhere for it, and he was going to be held responsible for it. And he wasn't anywhere near the American Army. He said it took him forever to get that pistol off of his record so that he didn't get charged with it. So that was the worst thing about that attack. During his stay in Italy, of course, he was not a combat soldier, and he said that he only fired one gun in his life in anger at anybody. And the situation was he was riding along the road in a Jeep, and with a driver, and they passed by this battery of British 105 howitzers, which is a cannon, and he said, stop the Jeep. So the fellow stopped the Jeep, and he got out, and he walked up to this captain who was in charge of this battery, and he says, how's everything going? Says, righto, chappie. He says, everything's going just fine. And they were apparently lobbing shells onto a crossroads up the way. And he said, said, I've been here for a year and a half. Said, I never have fired a gun at anybody. He said, let me shoot one of your cannons. Righto, sir. And he says, line them up, boys. And everybody got out there, ranged stakes, and they started fiddling with the thing. Says, right. Says, everything's right. Says, just walk over there to number one and yank on the lanyard. And he walks over there and he pulls the lanyard, bang, the gun goes off. He gets back in the Jeep and drives on down the road. Well, that was sort of a lark at the time, but later on, although he never really said so, I think that when he told that story, it got less and less funny to him, and that he, years on down the road, had wished that he could have maintained his absolute non-combatant status, where he was on the receiving end of those shells instead of on the delivering end. But that's the only time he ever had occasion to shoot at anybody.
What were some of the towns he went through as he proceeded?
All of them in the British sector. He went through Ravenna, Naples, Rome, just all of them. And of course, as he came back a major, as the war progressed, his area of responsibility got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I asked him one time, he got back in 1945, and I asked him, I said, well, what were you doing in Italy at the end? Well, what happened was, if I can back up a little bit, he had been a liaison officer with the British 8th Army. Of course, he was still an American officer. And the system was to rotate these officers back and forth so that they got a sense of what the other army was doing and vice versa. Well, when it came his time to rotate back to the American Army, he liked the British Army so good, he said, no, said, if it's all right with you, I'll just stay where I am. And his commanding officer, a fellow named Group Captain Benson, said, oh, said, if you'd stay, it would just be wonderful. Said, we really taking a shine to you. So they wanted him to stay, and he wanted to stay, and he stayed with the British all the way up through the boot of Italy. At the end, he was literally controlling vast areas of the north of Italy, just by himself. There was nobody except his chain of command. Of course, by that time the Italians were allies, but still, when the allies moved out and the military government moved in, they had to sort out the sheep from the goats. They had to determine who was fascist and who was anti-fascist, and to set the civilian government back up, they had to get these people who were fascist out of the way. They couldn't turn that over to them. George Patton in Germany, under the same circumstances, got into a world of trouble because he wanted to put the Nazis back in charge of the civilian population, because he said they knew how to make the waterworks and the railroads run. But the Allies didn't look very kindly toward that sort of behavior, so that was pretty much his job, was in preparation to set up reestablish the civilian control of the areas. He was choosing mayors and aldermen and engineers and whatnot and so forth. So it was a pretty, at the end, it was a pretty responsible job. And I said to him, I said, I said, that must have been an awful letdown for you to be absolutely in control of all of these people and all of this stuff, and then to come back to Atlanta, Georgia, and to start practicing law on the 3rd floor of the Grant building. And of course, I suspect that about that time he'd had enough. The war was winding down. But he wound up in Albania.
Tell us about that experience.
Yeah, well, he was out of the British Army by that time, and the Americans were trying to see to it that the communists didn't get Albania, so he was sent up there. And I think because of his, I believe, although I have no way to know it, the records don't say so, that he was involved in military intelligence, which is a real gray sort of issue. But I believe that he was in Albania in an intelligence capacity. Like I said, he never would talk about it. In fact, I asked him one time, and he says, "I can't tell you. Don't ask me." And that was the end of that. But he was in Albania to try to keep the communists from taking Albania over. Of course, it was not successful, although I guess Tito was better than Joe Stalin. But
So he couldn't really share his experiences in Albania?
No, but he said that the Albanians were something else. He said that of course they had been for centuries. They had been right in the midst of competing world forces, and he said those people up there would just as soon cut your throat and look at you, when he was there. But there wasn't a whole lot he could say. At the end of the war, and I'm going to, with your permission, I'm going to insert it.
Sure.
At the end of the war in Europe, of course, he was there after the war, after the armistice with Germany was signed, the end of combat operations, and of course the Italians had given up a long time ago. He had orders delivered to him that transferred him to the Pacific. He was going to be transferred across America. He was given 30 days leave in Atlanta to visit my mother and me. And he was headed for Japan. Okinawa, maybe, or who knows. And of course, on August the 8th, the U.S. dropped the atomic bomb, and that ended the war in Japan. You need to change that.
Yeah, I'll turn this over.
Is it written now? Yeah, by golly, it had. Don't time fly when you're having fun. But he had orders. He was headed to the Pacific, and I have done quite a bit of study on the U.S. atomic bomb project and the Enola Gay, the whole Manhattan project, and the operation of dropping those weapons. And several years ago, I read in the newspaper or saw on television that the Smithsonian Institution had taken the front half of the fuselage of the B-29 bomber that dropped the bomb, the Enola Gay, commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets, and they had stuck it in the building there without the wings, without the back half or anything else. And there was some legend on the display that on August the 8th at 7:45 in the morning, the peace-loving people of Japan had this terrible thing dropped on them. And it just really got to the middle of me, because if that bomb hadn't been dropped, if we hadn't developed that weapon, and of course, by that time, 50 million people throughout this world had died of this horrible conflict. And 80,000 people died in Hiroshima, and another 70,000 died in Nagasaki, and then some more after that. But 50 million people had been killed by that time, by August of 1945. And whoever the idiot was that put this sign up on this airplane, that the peace-loving people of Japan had suffered this terrible weapon. And I thought to myself, yeah, and for 30 days I might have had a dad, and if that weapon hadn't been dropped, I might not have had one from then on. So it got real personal to me. I called up the Smithsonian and tried to get hold of the fellow that wrote that, and they wouldn't let me talk to him. They said, no, we've had enough of your comments.
I imagine yours was not the first call.
No.
When your father heard that the bomb had been dropped and his comrades heard that, what was their reaction? Did he ever say, did he realize that might be saving his life, or was it years later that he realized that?
I don't think my dad ever considered that his life was ever in danger. I don't, during the whole time, whether he was under shelling or whatever, I don't think it ever occurred to him that anything was ever going to happen to him. He was a whole lot more worried about the cold in the wintertime in Italy because there wasn't any coal or wood to burn anything to keep warm. I think he was a whole lot more worried about that than he was about anything happening to him. But of course, once the war was over, he was ready to get out of there. He'd had all of that he wanted, and he came back. He came back in 1945. I think he got here about August, and we lived on Longwood Drive in Atlanta, right across from the golf course, right next to the golf course. And I was outside playing in a mimosa tree that lined the street. And of course he got to Atlanta and he called the house 4 or 5 times before he ever got there. I'm coming. I'm here. I'm at the station. So he called the house 4 or 5 times before he got there. Well, when he got there, of course, I didn't ever remember seeing him. I knew who he was. I knew he was coming, but I hadn't remembered anything about him at all because he'd gone by the time before I was real conscious. Although I do remember a lot about World War II. And so he came in the house, and I ran and greeted him, and it was a big hoopla and everything. And 5 minutes later, I was out back in this monster tree.
See you later.
I knew he was, but he wasn't a real big part of my life at the time.
He was later, though.
Oh yeah, yeah. Talking about the war, I remember quite a bit about the war. I remember towing cars, the gas rationing, and if you needed 2 cars in one place, it was cheaper to tow one. If you were going on a trip, to tow one where you were going than it was to drive them both. And one thing that I remember was the coupons, the ration stamps. And they looked like little bitty postage stamps, cheap postage stamps. And I got those out one day, and of course this was the sugar for the month, and the meat for the month, and the clothes for the month, and the gasoline for the month. I was up there playing post office with them. And my mother nearly had a heart attack.
There goes the sugar for the month.
Yeah.
Did your father ever say whether he realized how significant World War II was while he was in it, or was just?
There was no doubt.
He realized that was one of the most significant events.
There was no doubt that he understood that this was a fight against freedom and a Republican form of government, or the Dark Ages. He didn't have any doubt at all that if the Germans got control of Europe, that the world would be plunged into a dark age. I mean that never was even a question. And he was there until the end. And of course, if he'd been shipped to Japan, he'd have gone. But what a waste that would have been.
We've got a few more minutes. Let me ask you something, since you mentioned him coming back from the service. Either from what he said or from what you observed, how hard was it for him to adjust to being back home after being through a war for 4 years?
Not at all. Not at all. My dad was extremely compartmentalized. He lived several lives simultaneously. He was an attorney, and when he was an attorney, that's all that he was. And when he was home, he was father and husband, and that's all that he was. I had to really try to get him to talk about his the other parts of his life, because once he was engaged in one facet of it, the others were just completely put out of mind. And he was an officer in the military, and when he was, that was all that he was. So no, once he got back, he just jumped right back into it. It didn't take him. I guarantee you, not only did he not lose any sleep about it, it didn't take him 5 seconds. When he sat down in his chair behind his desk, it was just like he'd never left.
Well, he sounds like quite a man, and I know you're proud of him. Is there anything else you would like to tell us about your father's experiences?
The postscript to all of this is that he stayed in the Georgia Air National Guard. He was the commanding officer of Dobbins Air Force Base, the Air Guard part of it. And he was president of the National Guard Association of America, which is a nationwide organization. And he rose to the rank of Brigadier General. And the highest post that he ever attained was as Assistant Adjutant General for Air of the state of Georgia. which is a political post, but it's also in the military. And he practiced law all of his life. When I was growing up in Atlanta, like I said, Atlanta was nothing but a large, small town. And Dad knew everybody in town. Not only that, he knew everybody in the state of Georgia. I would be, after I turned 16 and started driving, I would be off in some little podunk town in South Georgia or something and need a run out of gas or have a flat tire or something. And I'd call him and tell him what my problem was. And he said, oh, just go around the corner. He said, where are you? And I'd tell him, and he says, oh, just go around the corner there. Oh, so-and-so in the drugstore says, just tell him who you are, and he'll help you. And he didn't call the man up and tell him I was coming. But by the time I got around there and told him who I was, oh, listen, it was just like the prodigal son had returned. And that happened way more than once. Oh, yeah.
What was your dad's complete name? I want to be sure we get that.
His name was James Carr Grizzard. He didn't use senior.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I can't tell you how much we appreciate you taking your time and sharing the experiences of your father and of yourself. And this will mean a lot to this project to have this story.
Well,
and,
thank you very much.
Thank you very much.